Imagine you're a doctor, you've got a patient who comes coming back with these gut infections. You've tried antibiotics, obviously, but they just keep coming back. What if, and stick with me here, what if it wasn't just about getting rid of the bad bacteria? What if the answer was in helping the body, take control of its own kind of internal ecosystem?
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that's becoming more and more central to how we think about the microbiome these days. For years, research was all about identifying the microbes themselves, figuring out which were the good guys and which were the bad guys. But now we're realizing, or beginning to realize, that the host, the body, plays a way more active role in shaping and controlling that gut microbiome than we ever thought before.
So we're not just talking about a bunch of microbes hanging out.
Yeah.
Right? It's more like, a carefully managed space.
Exactly. It's like an ecosystem, but on a leash. And this is actually a concept that's discussed pretty extensively in this 2024 Science Review article we're looking at today. It's called Host Control of the Microbiome, Mechanisms, Evolution, and Disease.
Host control of the microbiome. I like that. This review, by the way, it's by Wild, Slack, and Foster, right? And they go into a whole bunch of these control mechanisms, which is just, I don't know, it's kind of mind-blowing how many tools the body has for this.
It really is.
So where do we even start with this? Like, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the body, controlling the microbiome?
Well, the immune system is a good place to start. We all know it's there to fight infection, but it's also essential for managing the microbiome. For example, certain immune cells have these receptors called TLRs, and those TLRs, they detect microbes that are trying to get across the gut lining.
Oh, so it's like a border patrol.
Yeah, exactly. It's like having a security checkpoint to make sure that only the right microbes are getting through.
Interesting. So what about antibodies? They're obviously key for fighting off pathogens, but do they do anything for the microbiome too?
They absolutely do. In fact, IgA, which is a type of antibody that's really abundant in the gut, it can actually coat bacteria, and that prevents them from attaching to the gut lining and causing all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting. IgA can also sometimes actually promote colonization or even protect certain bacteria.
Wait, so it can, help the bacteria too?
It can, yeah. It's all about balance. That's why we have to be really careful when we're looking at these studies, Some studies have just wiped out parts of the immune system in different animals to see what happens, but that doesn't always paint a clear picture. It's a complex system.
So basically, the immune system isn't just about fighting the bad guys. It's also about, keeping the peace, making sure everyone's behaving themselves.
Exactly. And it's not just the immune system either. The body also uses physical barriers to control the microbiome. Skin is an obvious one, but even the lining of the gut that's carefully designed to keep microbes where they belong.
And what about mucus? That seems like it's it's more than just slime, right?
Oh, it definitely is. Mucus is actually a pretty sophisticated barrier. The host is constantly producing and modifying it, and it acts as a physical barrier, obviously, but it can also be a food source for microbes and even a place where they can attach.
Wow, so it's like a multi-purpose tool.
Exactly. And this isn't just in our guts either. A lot of organisms have something similar, amphibians, even plants. It might not be mucus, but it's mucilage, and it does a similar job.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about keeping the wrong microbes out, right?
Yeah.
It's also about creating the right environment for the ones we do want.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, especially when you're thinking about it from a healthcare perspective. Our bodies actively control the environment where these microbes live, and that influences which ones can thrive.
Okay, so what are some of the ways we do that? I mean, how do we create this perfect environment?
Well, oxygen is a big one.
Yeah.
You see, even before any microbes even get into the gut, our bodies keep the oxygen levels there really low.
Really?
Yeah. And this might seem counterintuitive, but it actually helps those beneficial bacteria that do well in low oxygen environments.
Wow. So even before the microbes show up, the body's already setting the stage.
Exactly. And we've seen this in studies with germ-free mice and even cockroaches. Even without any microbes, they still have low gut oxygen. So it seems like it's something the host does actively.
So it's not just a side effect of the microbes being there. It's like we're preparing for them.
Exactly. And that control over the environment, it's not just oxygen. The host can also control nutrient availability, pH levels, even the physical structure of the gut, all to shape the microbiome. A good example is, think about the gut of an herbivore. Super complex to help with fermentation, right? But then you look at a carnivore, and their gut is much simpler.
So the gut is like a I don't know, like a tailored environment.
Yeah, exactly. And a really interesting example of this is, well, it's the panda. Pandas are bears, of course, but they evolved to eat bamboo.
Mhm.
And that requires a totally different microbiome for digestion. But their digestive system is, honestly, it's kind of inefficient, hasn't quite caught up to their new diet. So they're kind of an example of, well, poor host control.
Because they haven't had enough time to adapt.
Right, exactly. So it shows you host control. It's not just about keeping things static. It's an ongoing process.
It's evolving all the time.
Exactly.
And for healthcare providers, that has to be, that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. So it's not just about knowing what microbes are there, but how the host is influencing them. Which actually, that makes me think of another point from the review, this idea of transit. Seems like our bodies have, well, a pretty efficient way of getting rid of microbes we don't want.
Oh, yeah. It's all about peristalsis, those the contractions that move food through our digestive system. That constant movement creates a really tough environment for microbes. They have to adapt or, well, get swept away.
So it's like a microbial obstacle course.
Exactly. Only the fittest survive. And that peristalsis, it creates a kind of selection pressure. The microbes that can attach to the gut lining or swim against the current or divide really quickly, those are the ones that make it.
It's amazing to think that, how fast food moves through our system can have such a big impact on the microbiome.
It really does.
It's like this whole web of interactions.
Exactly. And let's not forget about host behavior. What we choose to do, especially what we eat, that has a huge impact on what microbes are in our gut.
So it's not just about, feeding the good bacteria, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to think about how diet affects those control mechanisms. Mucus, immune function, even how fast things move through.
You got it. It's not about micromanaging every single microbe. It's about supporting the body's ability to do what it does naturally.
So instead of being like a mechanic, we're more like, architects.
Yes.
Designing the whole system.
I like that, yeah. And there are simple things people can do that make a difference, like avoiding spoiled foods, right? That helps minimize the risk of those nasty pathogens.
Makes sense. And on the flip side, things like fermented foods, those can introduce beneficial bacteria and boost diversity.
Exactly.
Speaking of boosting those good microbes, the review mentioned, something kind of strange. Coprophagy.
Us.
Some animals, they eat their own droppings, which, I'm not recommending that to anyone, but it does show how important that microbiome is.
It definitely shows you how far some species will go. But moving on, maybe the most important part of host control is choosing which microbes get in the first place.
Right, like setting the guest list for the party.
Exactly. And the host is the bouncer, deciding who gets in.
And that selection process, it starts really early.
Yeah.
Right? Think about breast milk. All those special sugars and antibodies, they shape the infant microbiome.
Absolutely. And that's one reason why breastfeeding is so beneficial. Those components in breast milk, they specifically help certain bacteria grow. It gives those babies a good start.
So it's not just what they're eating, it's also the environment that the milk creates.
Exactly. And it can be really, really specific too. Look at the bobtail squid. It's light organ. It's evolved so that only bioluminescent bacteria can survive there.
Wow. So no one else gets in.
Nope. It's like a very exclusive club.
But even once the right microbes are there, the host doesn't just stop, right? There's still work to do managing that community.
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant process. And that's where resource availability comes in. The host can actually manipulate the levels of certain nutrients, like iron, to control which microbes do well. There's this protein, lipocalin-2, and it actually binds to iron so certain bacteria can't use it.
So it's like, a game of musical chairs. The host is controlling who gets a seat, who gets the resources.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And another tactic is controlling how well microbes can stick to the gut lining. Remember IgA? Those antibodies, well, they can clump bacteria together, which makes them easier to flush out.
So it's like a constant balancing act.
Exactly. The host is always trying to keep things in check, making sure no one species takes over. And the structure of the gut itself plays a role too. It's not just a smooth tube. There are all these folds and crypts, and that creates different microenvironments. So the types of bacteria in the mucosa, the lining of the gut, can be really different from what's in the lumen, the space in the middle.
Like a city with different neighborhoods for different types of microbes.
I like that, yeah. And the host is the city planner. But it gets even more interesting. The host can also influence how those microbes behave, their metabolism.
So we're setting the house rules too.
Exactly. Like, for instance, when a mouse gets infected, its body starts producing more taurine. And that not only helps the bacteria that use taurine as fuel, but it also leads to the production of sulfide, which actually inhibits the growth of harmful bacteria.
So it's like nudging them in the right direction, get them to do what we want.
Right. And remember how we talked about oxygen levels before? Well, that also affects microbial metabolism. By keeping oxygen low, the host encourages fermentation, and that produces all sorts of beneficial byproducts, like butyrate.
Which is important for the cells in the gut.
Exactly. It's like,
Huh.
I don't know, the host is training its microbial workforce.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But this level of control, it's not just about individual microbes, right? It's also about the whole community.
Exactly. The host can actually manipulate how microbes interact with each other. It's a form of ecological engineering, I guess you could call it. And that's where things like crypts come in. They can act as little sanctuaries for certain types of microbes, limiting competition and helping them coexist.
So the host is like a park ranger managing the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But of course, microbes aren't just sitting there passively. They're evolving, they're adapting. They might even find ways to get around the host's control.
Right, because they're evolving too.
Exactly. So it's this constant dance between the host and the microbes.
And that evolution can be good or bad, right? I mean, sometimes microbes evolve traits that benefit the host, but sometimes they evolve to escape control.
That's a really important point. It's a double-edged sword. And this is where the difference between trait-based and genotype-based discrimination comes in. See, a lot of those host control mechanisms, they target traits, not specific strains.
So even if a microbe changes genetically, as long as it still has that trait, the host can still manage it.
Exactly. Makes it much harder for microbes to escape. And then you have adaptive immunity that's based on recognizing specific genotypes, but it can learn, it can adapt. It's like having a security system that can update its threat database.
That's incredible. But I mean, some microbes still manage to get around all of this, right? I'm thinking of like those classic pathogens.
Of course, and their strategies are really a testament to their evolutionary brilliance. Like Shigella, for instance. It can actually suppress the inflammasome response, which is one way our bodies get rid of infected cells. Or C. diff, it not only suppresses gut motility, it also resists iron sequestration.
So they're fighting back.
They are. And then you have the ones that don't just evade control, they actually exploit it. This plant pathogen, Agrobacterium, it actually hijacks a host immune protein to insert its own DNA into the plant's genome.
Wow, that's like a Trojan horse.
It is. It's using the host's own defenses against it. Makes you wonder if there are, human pathogens doing similar things.
Well, there are. And I think one of the most impressive examples is Salmonella. It's a master manipulator. It actually triggers this huge inflammatory response, which wipes out a lot of the normal gut bacteria, and that gives Salmonella a chance to take over.
It's a brilliant, albeit somewhat terrifying strategy.
It shows just how complex this arms race between hosts and microbes really is.
It really does.
And it means that we have to think differently about the microbiome. It's not just about the microbes themselves, it's about the host and that whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, it could lead to entirely new ways to treat patients.
Like imagine being able to strengthen the host's defenses, make that mucus layer stronger, or optimize oxygen levels, maybe even target specific microbial behaviors.
Exactly. And that's especially important as we get older. The microbiome tends to get less stable, we're more susceptible to disease, and a lot of that is probably due to those host control mechanisms weakening.
So it's like we've had this powerful tool all along, but we didn't know how to use it.
Exactly. And the more we learn about these control mechanisms, the better we'll be able to help patients. It's an incredibly exciting field, really has the potential to revolutionize healthcare.
Wow, this has been, it's been like a crash course in host control. Really makes you appreciate just how much is going on in there.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I think the big takeaway for healthcare providers is that, we're not just helpless bystanders when it comes to the microbiome. Our bodies have evolved all these amazing ways to manage it.
So it's about working with our bodies, not against them.
Right.
And that means, seeing the microbiome as part of us, not something separate.
Exactly. It's a whole new way of thinking about health.
But it does make you wonder, if these control mechanisms are so powerful, why do we still get sick? I mean, those recurring infections we talked about at the beginning, why do those keep happening?
That's a really good question. And it comes down to this constant battle between the host and the microbes. We talked about how microbes are always evolving. Sometimes they find ways to get around even the best defenses.
So it's like an arms race.
Exactly. And there are a few reasons why that might happen. Sometimes it's something external, like antibiotics or a big change in diet. That can disrupt the balance and weaken the host's control.
Throws the whole system off.
Yeah. And sometimes it's the microbes themselves. They evolve ways to, evade or even exploit those control mechanisms, like Shigella or Salmonella.
Let's figure out how to turn the table.
Exactly. It's a back and forth, this constant push and pull. And that's why research is so important. The more we understand, the better we'll be at treating these issues.
So where do we go from here? What are the big questions that need answering?
Well, I think one of the biggest is understanding why some people have a more resilient microbiome than others. What role do genes play, or lifestyle, or the environment?
It's like personalized medicine for the microbiome.
Exactly.
Right.
We need to move beyond those general recommendations and figure out what works for each individual. Because the microbiome is so diverse, what helps one person might not help another.
And if we can figure that out, it could lead to some really exciting new treatments. I mean, instead of just killing microbes, we could be strengthening the host's defenses.
Exactly. Or even manipulating microbial behavior, encouraging the good ones, suppressing the bad ones.
So many possibilities.
It's an exciting time to be in this field, that's for sure.
Well, I have to say, this has been eye-opening. Really changes how you think about the microbiome. Any final thoughts for our listeners, especially those healthcare providers out there?
Don't be afraid of the complexity. It's a challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity. And remember, it's not just about the microbes, it's about the host. Think beyond the microbe. Explore the host.
Great advice. And for anyone who wants to dig deeper into this, we highly recommend that 2024 Science Review article, Hosts Control the Microbiome: Mechanisms, Evolution, and Disease. It's by Wild, Slack, and Foster. Really gives you a good overview of the field.
It's a great resource.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into host control. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little inspiring. Because the future of medicine, well, it lies in understanding this incredible partnership between the host and the microbiome. Disclaimer and bibliography in the description.